begin the award ceremony. And again, thank you all for being here today. We have a number of students today, and among them many student leaders and student scholarship winners. I would like all of them, all the students who are in the room, I'd just like you to stand for a second. Just to stand and be recognized. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for all that you do here at the university. This year marks the 12th anniversary of the Payne Awards for Ethics in Journalism, which recognizes journalists who demonstrate an extraordinary commitment to ethical conduct, even when faced with economic, personal, or political pressure. Ancil Payne, the former CEO of King Broadcasting and a former member of our Journalism Advancement Council at the School of Journalism and Communication, established that company's reputation for ethical journalism and established the Payne Awards for Ethics in Journalism in the School of Journalism and Communication in the late 1990s. Ancil championed the award in the cause of ethical journalism up until the time of his death in 2004. His vision was to create an award that would improve the state of journalism, to celebrate journalists making ethical decisions in the face of personal, political, or economic pressures, with the belief that celebrating these journalists would instruct and inspire future generations of journalists. The Payne Awards was the result of that vision. And Ancil, who was fond of saying that he wasn't a journalist, I don't know how many times I heard him say over the years, "I never set a stick of type," a phrase that most people in this room don't know what that means, but there are a few of us who, even a couple of people in this room as I look around, who actually probably set a stick of type now and then. But there have been few media executives then or now who better understood or had a passion for good journalism. It is one of the great privileges that I had of knowing Ancil Payne and spending many hours talking about journalism and what good journalism meant and democratic politics too, but that's another day. Today we honor a major national news organization, a community newspaper journalist, a student newspaper staff, and a photojournalist. And this year's winners of the Payne Awards and of Payne citations join past winners in demonstrating that journalism ethics have never been more important, and that journalists continue to risk lives, career, and economic security to make tough decisions and do the right thing. They believe that ethical journalism is essential to a healthy democracy, and that journalists' primary responsibility is to the public interest. And I think it's worth pausing for a moment to note the very sad news of the last 24 hours and the loss of two photojournalists covering war, and note just again that there are thousands of journalists around the world who every day put their lives in danger so that we as the public can be informed. These are volatile, uncertain, and exciting times for journalism. Digital technology has disrupted established business models, eliminated economic and technical barriers that helped define journalism for much of its history, created unimagined and wonderful opportunities for community discussion and engagement, and forced us to think about journalism in new ways and to figure out how we define journalism in this age. But the core of the definition of a journalist has not changed. Journalists serve the public interest. They seek truth, they stand for ethical principles of the profession, and they make tough decisions in order to do the right thing. And I'm very proud to honor the memory of Ancil Payne and join you today in honoring these journalists that we will be honoring today, who are exemplars of that principle. I'd also like to extend our deepest appreciation on behalf of the School of Journalism and Communication to Valerie Payne, Ancil's widow, who is not with us today. I had the opportunity to visit with Valerie not long ago in Seattle, and I know that this weekend she will be listening to the podcasts of the Payne Award interviews, and her interest and commitment to this award continues unabated. And I'm very, very happy to be able to introduce and thank Ancil Payne Barker, that works, Ann Payne Barker, the daughter of Ancil. lecturer who is with us today and will be delivering the Rule lecture later this afternoon, a University of Oregon graduate, Jerry Van Dyke. Jerry, where are you? And the Rule lecture is this afternoon at 4 o'clock. Hope to see you there. The first 2011 Payne Award goes to the New York Times for its coverage of WikiLeaks. And here to represent the New York Times is Bill Yardley, the New York Times Seattle Bureau Chief. So, Bill. When the New York Times confronted the opportunity to publish classified documents released by Julian Assange and the whistleblowing website WikiLeaks, Bill Keller, the editor of the Times, and other editors realized that the paper had to establish a relationship with WikiLeaks that preserved its editorial autonomy and credibility, and to carefully balance the personal safety, privacy, and national security interests. I think it's hard, if not impossible, for any of us in this room to fully appreciate the pressure cooker that the Times found itself in at that moment. With WikiLeaks information being shared not just with the Times, but with several other news organizations, with all of the high-profile coverage of it, and with the complexity of the amount of information that the Times had to process and get out in a quick fashion. But even in this environment, they understood that while media environment is changing, journalists' obligation to exercise critical, thoughtful, ethical editorial judgment remains. Before publishing on the Times print and digital platforms, the paper vetted all of the supplied materials, consulted with the U.S. government about highly sensitive material, a decision in and of itself that is ripe with controversy as to what extent you consult with the government before publishing, and edited to protect the lives of identified individuals. In addition, Keller and others at the Times engaged in the public discussion of the paper's decisions, thereby advancing our understanding of the ethical choices made. And if you haven't had the opportunity to look at some of the material that has been published post-WikiLeaks by the Times concerning the decision it made, why it made it, how it made it, I encourage you to do so. I think it's really a model for how to deal with these kinds of complicated decisions. In certain cases, lives were at stake, the Payne judge's statement read. The Times made thoughtful, careful, calculated, and line-by-line decisions on what they would print and why. To take people through those leaked documents, as well as through the paper's process and dealing with them, was not only an amazing act of public service, but a fabulous service to journalists all over the United States. WikiLeaks is a harbinger of things to come, and the New York Times handled it well. So, Bill, would you come forward and accept on behalf of the Times? For those of you who have not been to a Payne Awards presentation in the past, let me just show you the Payne Award, which, if you can't see it, well, you can't see it, I know you can't see it, has a mirror on this side and the inscription reversed on the other side. And the concept of this, and these awards were designed by designers at Wieden and Kennedy, the concept of this is if you're going to be an ethical journalist or an ethical person, you get up every morning and you look in the mirror.
I'm truly here just as a representative of the newspaper, but I just want to express our gratitude and how honored we are to receive the award. Thanks so much,
The second Payne Award goes to Stanley Nelson, editor of the Concordia Sentinel, for his fearless investigation of a murder from the civil rights era of the 1960s. And before I go into a description of the award, let me note that Stanley was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize earlier this week. So, congratulations. Here today with Stanley is his daughter, Tessa Granger, and also with him, and we're very happy to have been able to make this connection happen, is retired FBI agent Billy Bob Williams and his wife Ann Williams. Billy Bob worked with Stanley on this case for a number of years, and but it was all on the phone and otherwise. If I understand it correctly, today is the first day that they actually in person, or last night was the first time that they were together in person, having worked on this story for many years. So we're happy to have made that happen. Stanley is a seasoned newspaper reporter from Faraday, Louisiana, who refused to forget about the unsolved, racially motivated 1964 murder of Frank Morris, who died from burns he suffered when his shoe repair shop was set on fire. With the weight of history and community pressures on his back, Nelson pursued the truth. Having previously reported on the Ku Klux Klan, Nelson knew that his digging would make many unhappy and threaten his personal safety, and place his paper in financial risk. The 3-year series, which included more than 200 articles, promoted the FBI to reopen the investigation into the case. And as a result of this series, Nelson's publishers received at least one credible death threat, and the newspaper lost subscriptions. You can imagine that Nelson was in the spotlight in his community. This series represented, according to Payne judges, as pure a definition of journalism courage as one could craft in 2011. The paper was ready to publish the name of the alleged murderer in December of last year, but held off at the request of the Justice Department officials so the FBI could complete its investigation. A grand jury was convened in February. The story also led to the founding of the Cold Case Justice Initiative at Syracuse University, of which Nelson is a board member. One of the relatives of Frank Morris said, quote, "My family has waited for a long time to find out what happened to my grandfather. Words could never say what it means to me that the folks at the Concordia Sentinel and the Syracuse University Cold Case Justice Initiative have stood by our side for so long and helped us fight for justice for him and for all the families." Stanley?
Thank you very much, Dean. It takes a long time and a lot of help to be able to do these kind of stories, and but the main thing you have to have is to work for a newspaper family that will let you do it, and they have. And I see Mr. Payne's daughter over there, and I appreciate longevity in this field and people that stick around in it. It's an honor. Everybody here has been really nice to me, and almost feels like home, and I'm just very grateful. Thank you.
In addition to the 2 Payne Awards we're giving this year, the judges decided that we should also issue 2 special citations. We had well over 30 worthy entries for the Payne Awards this year. It's a judging competition or process that it's a wonderful seminar that goes on for a number of hours, and at the end of it, it was determined that there were 2 entries, 2 nominations that needed to be recognized over and above the 2 Payne Award winners. The first is a Payne citation that is going to New York Times photographer Damon Winter, who earned the citation for his careful and sensitive coverage of the devastation and death in the aftermath of the January 2010 Haiti earthquake. It was a situation the New York Times Lens co-editor David Dunlap described as requiring journalists to, quote, invent a code of ethics on the spot. Damon described the decision as being a trade-off of respect for the people in the photo with how effectively it tells the story. He said, "Would I be able to comfortably take this picture and show it to the subject and be okay about it?" As many in this room appreciate, one of the great struggles in covering disasters of any sort, but especially disasters in an international context, is remembering that there are people involved. Winter went on to say, what makes for ethical coverage is not simply what pictures one takes or doesn't take. It's how deeply journalists go into stories and how long they stay with those stories. And for his coverage, and if you haven't looked at it, I strongly encourage you to do look at some of the photographs that he's taken. Just astonishing work. And anyway, for his coverage and for the way he did it, Damon Winter receives a Payne Special Citation. And he is not here today. The other special citation goes to a student newspaper, the Yale Daily News. And Paul Needham from Yale is out here with us today. He told me that he really fought to not have to miss any classes, but that's how it goes. And we really appreciate you making the trip out. The Yale Daily News was confronted with a real challenge following a very tragic suicide of one of its students in March of 2010. In the course of covering this story, the student journalists made careful editorial decisions to protect individuals' privacy, and they worked hard to provide context and meaning in the midst of a media firestorm. The students, in the nomination letter, have really framed this in ways better than I can, and I want to quote from their letter. As we published online updates and prepared the next day's paper, we were exceedingly careful to print only the facts of which we were certain, and only the details we considered significant and sensitive. And I think you have to understand this in the context of this was not a Yale University story. This was a suicide in New York City. This was those of you from the Northeast, this was a small media frenzy in the Northeast. We consulted deans, professors, mentors, parents, and medical professionals, and we repeatedly checked our coverage against the Center for Disease Control's guidelines for reporting on suicides, which are designed to minimize the risk that publicity could lead to more deaths. We determined to make mental health the focus of our coverage, emphasizing how students could seek help and how we as a community could do better. We did not, as other news outlets did, publish grisly wire photos from 34th Street, nor did we speculate on the possible motivations of the suicide victim. So extraordinary careful work done by student journalists, and for that, Paul, if you'd come forward for a special citation.
Class for this, and there are dozens of other people who didn't miss class, but who are in New Haven. And again, I was just the editor during all this, but I counted on the plane ride out here that all told we had 37 reporters, 8 photographers, 5 web producers, and 6 layout people who were involved in the story. So certainly it's a credit to all of them, and we're all very grateful for this recognition.
So I would now invite Tom Bivens, the Holting Chair in Media Ethics, and Stanley and Paul to come forward. We're going to have a little bit of a conversation. And I will note that Bill has asked to not be part of this simply because, having not been part of the WikiLeaks coverage, he really feels an ethical obligation to not speak as if he was.
I don't understand journalists' reluctance to make things up. Or maybe you're. Thanks. It's an honor to be here today and to help out with this. I've already had a chance to meet both of our winners here this morning when they spoke in a class that I was subbing for, and did a wonderful job. Students were very interested in what they had to say and curious and asked questions, and that was good.
which is not to say students aren't curious and ask questions, but I would like to. I'd like to start with Dr. Gleason and I suppose I should say D. Anyway, and ask him, Tim. Not so much what set these apart because you've already explained that, but what makes these kinds of winners of the Payne Ethics Award unique? Because as you said, we received over 30 entries. I was on the Payne judging panel. And this is not an award that's given just for really good journalism. Because we had 30 some odd awards, examples almost across the board of really superb journalism. This is an award that deals with ethical decision making and morality. Tim, maybe you could kind of encapsulate why you think the winners we chose, especially the two that are here today, represent that kind of morality in journalism that we're looking for.
Well, I think it's a combination of things. In part, I think that while yes, there's a lot of good work done, extraordinary work done, and if you were to contrast it, say, with the Pulitzers that were honored earlier or given out earlier this week, what distinguishes Payne winners is one, it's the context in which the work is done. Good journalism is what journalists are supposed to do. So when journalists do great work, when there are other pressures that could easily send them in a different direction. In this instance, I mean, Stanley could have this wasn't a story that, you didn't have competitors who were beating down the door to do this story, and this was a story that you did and your paper did because you believed that people need to know it. There wasn't any other reason to do it, and yet there were a lot of reasons to not do it. Life would have been more comfortable had you not done the story. I think in the case of the Yale Daily News, and you sort of have to have been in the middle of a situation where you have a high-profile story, where you have news organizations, whether they be college news organizations or professional news organizations, who are also on the same story, where you have a lot of stuff being published. For example, in this instance, the photographs of the suicide. It's very hard in that circumstance to say, no, we have a set of standards, and we believe that it's important for us to serve the public in this way. We're going to do what we think is right, no matter what the competition is doing, no matter what's on the front page of the Daily News, the New York Times, or whatever it may be. We're going to do it the way we think it ought to be done. And I think the same is true in the case of the WikiLeaks coverage, in that there was a lot of pressure to get that material out. There were a lot of things swirling around the New York Times at that moment, and yet the paper continued to focus on what it understood to be ethical, good decision making. So one is the context in which it's done. A second is something we've been putting more and more emphasis on in the Payne Awards in recent years, and that is the way in which the decision-making process, to the extent that, and every now and then you see an entry like this, that it's, you get an entry, and in effect, that people are saying, wow, we didn't know we did anything ethical, well, good for us. In every one of these instances, it was very clear that there had been a thoughtful process, that people had thought about the decisions they were making, and then we might not necessarily, this has happened in the past, we've given awards where we didn't necessarily agree with the decision, or there was a good debate on the judging panel over whether it was the right decision, but we believed that the decision had been made in a very thoughtful way and that it was consistent with the ethical standards of that organization. So in this instance, I think probably, at least in my own view, the way in which the Times is engaged in that discussion, I mean, their coverage was hardly without controversy, and yet they've engaged in the discussion about the coverage in a way that helps us all understand what the decision points were and how they were made, and maybe we agree, maybe we disagree, but at least we're talking about it. Probably longer than you wanted.
That's okay. I'm used to it. Tim and I have known each other far longer than I think either one of us suspected we would. I'd like to That was meant to be nice. I'd like to address the two winners today and ask you a question that I brought up briefly this morning in our discussion in class, and that is that the Payne Awards are given out, again, not just for ethical decisions, but ethical decisions that involve a certain level of pressure to perhaps do otherwise or do differently. And I'd like to ask both Stanley and Paul to maybe explain a little bit some of the pressures that you encountered when both of you worked your stories the way that you decided to work them. And maybe we'll start with Paul and talk about some of the pressures that were involved in doing this story, which was, as you mentioned this morning in class, Yale had endured a few negative stories in a few years preceding this, and this was one, and at that time must have seemed to the administration at Yale a string of bad publicity. Paul, what kinds of pressure did you encounter?
Yeah, I think there were two important sources of pressure. The first, and I think what you're talking about, that this was kind of the latest in a series of very high-profile incidents, either related to Yale or involving Yale. The first being in the last couple of years. The first being a very controversial senior art project that actually won a Drudge Siren, which is kind of Matt Drudge's signal that something's very important. And then there was a murder in a Yale lab building of a graduate student in the fall of 2009. It's ultimately shown there was a Yale lab technician who had killed her. And then this in the spring of 2010, and I don't say this to be gruesome, but I think it's important context, a Yale junior jumped off the Empire State Building, is the story that we're talking about here. Immediately attracted, I think in part because of kind of some of those incidents, but also just in part because the story was obviously of such interest to New York publications. It was the cover of the New York Post and the New York Daily News for 3 consecutive days. That kind of builds on itself national TV attention, and a whole lot of other kind of media sources ended up that we had satellite trucks parked all over campus, and there's an immediate pressure there on student journalists to kind of keep up, and the tendency is always to immediately report everything that's being reported by anybody else, even if you're not sure if it's true. And that was something that we worked very hard to avoid. The other challenge being that the New York Post and the New York Daily News in particular were actually at certain points impersonating our reporters, put us in a difficult place in terms of our relationship with the rest of the campus. Just because you had, the New York Post reporters were joking about it, but the first thing they did when they got to campus was go to the bookstore and buy Yale sweatshirts. And then started approaching students saying they're from the Yale Daily News and asking really fairly inappropriate questions, I think, that put us in a difficult place. And so the first challenge was just how do you kind of deal with these external media pressures? And then the second challenge, which was in part related to that, was how do you cover a suicide that obviously in some ways is just a horrendous story, and that really in some ways the kind of voyeur in all of us can want to get into the really nitty-gritty details of what happens at the observation deck of the Empire State Building, and how is it that someone jumps off that building, and all the different questions you can ask. What was in the suicide note? All these different things. And instead, and not that I think there's any good news that came out of this, but to focus our coverage maybe in a more productive area, which is to look at mental health at Yale, and to look at what kind of counseling opportunities were made available, and why kind of hadn't there been a more successful outcome here. And what's important to know is that's not a story that happened over 1 day or 2 days or 1 week. That's a story that really has been covered in the 13 months since this incident. And I think one place where newspapers and media organizations can play a very important role, and you see that even on the anniversary today of the BP oil spill, is in continuing to remind people that these things happened, sometimes horrible incidents, and that there were really important lessons that we all kind of learned in the immediate aftermath, but that we shouldn't forget them. And so I think it's to the newspaper's credit, and obviously to the reporters and the entire staff, that mental health has now become a major focus of the Yale administration, with a blue ribbon commission appointed, with a lot of changes made in terms of the number of counselors available, the hours the counselors are available, and kind of all the services offered to students. I think that's something that one would hope would come out of an awful incident no matter what, but I believe that certainly the newspaper's kind of relentless coverage helps make sure that would happen.
The hardest thing to consider from the newspaper's point of view or as a reporter, when you know, solving a murder is hard, but solving a 46-year-old murder is really hard. And solving one that occurred during such a terrible time in our history. And what, you know, I think maybe we realized initially is that a murder that occurred in 1964 that had a case that had been reopened that the FBI was looking at again is really a time that for our country that is important. You know, certainly a terrible era that because of the conditions in the South where there was such a lawless place, you know, that had never really been chronicled in our region. Concordia Parish was a place where it was full of graft and corruption and mean, horrible law enforcement people. It was a place that was infiltrated by the Carlos Marcello mob that along with the sheriff's office literally operated a brothel in the southern end of the parish, a very profitable one. And Verdi was the only town in the country, I'm quite sure, that had a slot machine in the post office. So you try to, you realize that you're onto a story about a man that was murdered, but also a story that historically, for the country, that we could write some final chapters on that whole era. In our particular region, many of those murders were basically unsolved. And you learn things and you face ethical questions, for instance, working with the FBI. When the FBI and Justice Department announced that they were going to look at these cases again, they actually came to town to visit me one day after I had written some articles and the U.S. Attorney came. And there was an attempt, and I think an honest attempt, to try to work with the media in resolving these cases. But the thing that I think we found is difficult for a reporter to work with the FBI because they tend to want any kind of information that you can provide, but they don't want to tell you anything in return. And so that's kind of a one-way street. In fact, I talked to Thomas Perez, who in January, after we wrote our story, before we wrote our story identifying the suspect, he's the head of the Civil Rights in the Justice Department. I asked him specifically, and I said, you know, it's hard. You know, we want to solve this case too, and I know that you do. But it's kind of like you want to, you know, can you tell us some specifics as to why you wanted us to hold the story? We were asked to hold it for a few weeks. He said, no, I can't. It's a one-way street. So there's just a lot of issues you have to deal with. And I do want to point one thing out before I just complete this thought. The one thing that you learn, that I have learned historically about that era, there's many misconceptions. What few of the people in this room understand, I didn't understand either, is how violent that era were, how many unsolved murders. We probably have 10 to 15 unsolved murders just in our area. Some of them may still yet be solved. Some of them probably will not be solved. But what the key thing is we don't have a whole lot of time, and the country has an opportunity to actually solve these cases. And apparently, you know, newspapers can play a key role. The one thing I learned is that were it not for the FBI during those days to come into parishes like Concordia, where there was no law enforcement, where when something happened to someone, people had no one to go to. But in Billy Bob Williams, who's sitting at this table right here, and tell you a quick story about him. When he came into Natchez in 1964, in July of 64, within just a few days, he was sitting in the office there one day, and this distraught woman walks in, and she told him, she said, the Klan got my boy, and her name was Bernice Connors, and her son was Joseph Edwards. So Joseph Edwards worked at a hotel in Vidalia. He was kidnapped sometime during the night of July 12, 1964. Hasn't been seen since. And there's evidence that lots of horrible things happened to him. Well, Billy Bob reported that to the New Orleans Bureau. He was in Mississippi, Louisiana, and also when you do this kind of reporting, you learn a lot about the FBI and Justice Department. But the point I want to make is, were it not for men like Billy Bob Williams who came in and they literally, now all of these cases weren't solved, but those agents in the field don't solve cases. The Justice Department takes them to court. I mean, they do the field work. But had they not come into Concordia Parish and to Natchez, God knows how long this era of clan violence would have continued, because at the very least what they did was they stopped it and it ended. And so the country should be grateful, and I'm grateful, to men like that who served this country very, very well. And largely it's unnoticed. So thank you.
At this point, I'd like to open it to questions from you folks out there and see what you've got. Or not. Yes.
So if WikiLeaks had existed back in the New York Times with the Pentagon Papers, with Daniel Ellsberg now being in jail at the private relief
Tim, you want to grab that one?
I think you have a dramatically different circumstance, but I have no idea what the answer is to that, Alan. I mean, I have no idea. But I think I don't think that they are parallel. There are parallel circumstances, on a number of levels. But I don't know the answer to that question.
Other questions? Yes.
I'm curious, when you were, did you encounter resistance among regular residents saying, why are you doing this thing? I mean, 45 years ago, or 46 years ago, I obviously worked on it a long time. Can you talk a little bit? If you did, and then how you dealt with it?
Oh, did we? Yeah, we did. And the common thing is, why in God's name do you want to stir all of that hate up again? As if we're stirring the hate up. But, we've had people cancel subscriptions. We did hear some rumblings from advertisers, but we didn't lose him. Our office was broken into. There were threats, and there were some people that were very, very unhappy about what we were doing. But you just keep writing and keep going, because you know that the people that are against it are going to be the most vocal, and probably early on the most vocal. And so you just deal with it, and you're careful, because some people really were upset. But you just deal with it. You don't let it get in the way.
And you also dealt a lot with the family of the alleged children, fair to say?
Yes.
Talking to those
Yes.
folks, can you tell me? I want to pry into your sources, but can you
No,
talk a little bit
the
about
one thing that I did was that I realized is that people in law enforcement know what happened. That's why I spent a great deal of time trying to find people like Billy Bob Williams, people that were on the ground. Ask me again, because I got turned
what was
around.
like the
The killer's family.
Yeah, I mean, they played a.
So as I'm calling law enforcement people, I made a list of law enforcement people that I knew about within our area, and so I'm going down a list over a period of time. And one day I called this man who lived in northern Louisiana, and he was a deputy in Concordia Parish in the 1980s. Told him what I was writing on. He says, I'm familiar with it. I said, well, I'm wondering if you ever heard anything about the Frank Morris murder. And he said, well, yeah, as a matter of fact, I did. And I said, well, really? And then he went on to tell me that his ex-brother-in-law, 40 years ago, while they were working one day, this man, his name is Bill, he knew that his brother-in-law at the time had been in the Klan, and he said, did you ever kill anybody? And the guy said, yeah, accidentally one time in Ferry. We went to Ferry to burn down the shoe shop and didn't expect anybody to be there. And that led to she actually had known another Klansman who confessed that he was with her ex-husband the night it happened. And then, probably the most interesting witness that we found was the 41-year-old son of the suspect, who said that he grew up hearing stories about his dad being in the Klan and about this trip they took to Faraday one night, and this murder occurred, and that they didn't expect anyone to be there, and it was an accident. Of course, I had a problem with it being an accident because when they saw Frank come to the front of the shop, they could have put their stuff back in the car and went home, but they didn't. So that was and that break came spring of last year, and it was. I mean, I had a plan, but it just happened that I finally talked to the right guy, and him having been in law enforcement had nothing to do with what he knew.
One more question?
Could I make a comment?
Oh, absolutely.
One of the biggest problems that we're having with these old cases is simply the passage of time. The victims are obviously dead. Many of the participants have passed on, and many of the investigators, I was one of the youngest investigators down there, so the guys that were 10, 12, 15 years older than I am have passed on or are in Alzheimer's units or something. So there's Stanley he's working with the next generation down, mostly rather than the actual participants. And that's going to be a problem. We're 20 years too late on all of these cases. And the reason there are so many of them is that at the time, it was just one right after another. You couldn't possibly investigate all of them and bring up the prosecution. And even if you did, you wouldn't get a conviction because juries would be terrorized by the Klan, or there'd be Klansmen on the juries, or the judge that was there was a Klansman or something like that.
Wow. We need to wrap up now, but I want to make a quick pitch because I invited a lot of my students to come here today. Normally I'd be teaching an ethics class, and this would be an easy sell, but I'm teaching a history class, and I find from talking to both of you today that this is also an easy sell, because what you've done, Stanley, is to look at something that was 46 years old and say this is still important. It's important enough for us to do something about it and to make it right. And Paul, in your case, I know that you're a history major, but I also know that what you said today, the months that you and your paper spent working on this story and bringing it up from a whole new angle, this has a resonance that's going to last over time. And I think everyone in journalism does that. Every time they write a story, it's something that's going to last over time. And with any luck, it's going to make a real difference. So congratulations to both of you, I think, for making a real difference.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you to our honorees for being on the panel, and another round of applause for all of our Payne Award winners this afternoon. I thank you all for being here and encourage you to join us later this afternoon for the Rule Lecture, and Jerry Van Dyke, who I guess is preparing for his lecture. So we'll see you all later today. Again, thank you so much for coming.